Let us travel back, together, through the quiet corridors of time, to a place where the air smells of olive groves and the salt of the Aegean Sea. We find ourselves in ancient Athens, sometime around the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. The sun sets slowly over the Acropolis, casting long golden shadows across the agora, the marketplace, where merchants pack away their wares and philosophers gather in the cooling evening air to talk. This is the world into which a very unusual man was born, a man who would change the way human beings think about thinking itself. But before we meet him, let us first understand the world he inhabited, the ideas that swirled around him like dust motes in the afternoon light, and the questions that hung unanswered in the Athenian air. Athens, in the 5th century before the Common Era, was experiencing what historians often call its golden age. Under the leadership of Pericles, the city had become a center of art, architecture, literature, and thought. The Parthenon was being constructed on the sacred rock of the Acropolis. Playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides were staging their tragedies in the great theatre of Dionysus. And in the streets, in the gymnasiums, and in the homes of wealthy citizens, people talked. They talked endlessly, passionately, and with great sophistication about politics, ethics, the gods, and the nature of reality itself. This was a society that valued speech, that cherished the art of persuasion, and that believed deeply in the power of human reason. Democracy, still young and experimental, required citizens to participate in the assembly, to argue their cases in court, and to deliberate on matters of war and peace. To be an Athenian citizen was, in many ways, to be a speaker, a person who could articulate their thoughts clearly and convince others of their views. But Athens was not the only place where Greek thinkers were asking profound questions. For more than a century before our story begins, philosophers in other parts of the Greek world had been engaged in a remarkable intellectual project. These thinkers, whom we now call the pre-Socratics, were scattered across the Greek colonies, in Ionia, on the coast of what is now Turkey, in southern Italy, in Sicily, and in other far-flung corners of the Mediterranean world. What united these early philosophers was a single, magnificent ambition. They wanted to understand the cosmos. Not through myth, not through the stories of gods and heroes that had satisfied earlier generations, but through reason, through observation, through careful thought about the underlying principles that govern the natural world. Consider Thales of Miletus, often regarded as the first philosopher in the Western tradition. Thales lived in the early 6th century before the Common Era, about 100 years before Socrates. He looked at the world around him, at the rivers and the rain, at the mist rising from the sea, at the way plants needed water to grow, and he asked a question that had never quite been asked in this way before. What is the fundamental substance from which all things are made? His answer, as you may have heard, was water. Now, we might smile at this today, knowing as we do about atoms and molecules and the periodic table of elements. But the importance of Thales' question was not in his answer. The importance lay in the asking. For the first time, a thinker was proposing that the bewildering variety of the natural world could be explained by a single underlying principle, something that human reason could discover and understand. After Thales came others. Anaximander, his student, proposed that the fundamental substance was something he called the apeiron, the boundless or the indefinite, something that had no specific qualities, but from which all specific things emerged. Anaximenes suggested it was air, which could become fire when it expanded, and water or earth when it compressed. Heraclitus of Ephesus, that enigmatic thinker who wrote in riddles and paradoxes, proposed that fire was the fundamental element, and that all things were in a constant state of flux and change. You cannot step into the same river twice, he famously declared. for other waters are ever flowing onto you. And then there was Parmenides of Elea, who took a radically different approach. Parmenides argued that change itself was an illusion. True reality, he claimed, was unchanging, unmoving, and eternal. What we perceive as change and motion is merely the deception of our unreliable senses. Only through pure reason, Parmenides insisted, could we grasp the true nature of what is. We should also mention Pythagoras and his followers, who flourished in southern Italy. Pythagoras is best remembered today for the theorem that bears his name, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. But for Pythagoras and his disciples, mathematics was not merely a practical tool. They believed that numbers were the key to understanding reality itself, that mathematical relationships underlay the structure of the cosmos, the harmony of musical intervals, the movements of the heavenly bodies, the proportions of beautiful objects. All of these, the Pythagoreans believed, reflected deep mathematical truths. Later still came the atomists, Leucippus and his student Democritus, who proposed that the universe was composed of tiny, indivisible particles they called atoms, from the Greek atomos, meaning uncuttable. These atoms move through empty space, combining and separating to form the various substances we perceive. It was a remarkably modern-sounding theory, anticipating by more than 2,000 years the atomic theories of modern chemistry and physics. These ideas may seem abstract, perhaps even obscure to us now, but they represent one of the great intellectual revolutions in human history. The pre-Socratic philosophers were inventing a new way of thinking about the world, what we might call natural philosophy, or what would eventually become science. They were replacing mythological explanations with rational ones. They were seeking universal principles that applied everywhere and always, not just the whims of capricious gods. Yet for all their brilliance, these early thinkers were focused almost entirely on the external world. They wanted to know what the stars were made of, why earthquakes occurred, how the seasons changed. They were cosmologists, in a sense, students of the cosmos, the ordered universe. What they did not spend much time considering was the inner world, the world of human values, human conduct, and human knowledge itself. This is where our story takes a turn, for by the middle of the 5th century, a new class of thinkers had arrived in Athens. They called themselves sophists, from the Greek word sophia, meaning wisdom, and they brought with them a very different set of interests and concerns. The sophists were traveling teachers, intellectuals for hire who moved from city to city, offering instruction in the arts that ambitious young men most needed. And in democratic Athens, the art they most needed was rhetoric, the ability to speak persuasively, to argue a case, to win debates. The sophists promised to teach their students how to succeed in public life, how to climb the ladder of political influence, and how to prevail in the law courts. Some of these sophists were genuinely brilliant thinkers. Protagoras, perhaps the most famous of them all, declared that man is the measure of all things. By this, he seemed to mean that there are no absolute truths independent of human perception and judgment. What seems true to you is true for you. What seems true to me is true for me. This was a form of relativism, the idea that truth and morality are not fixed and universal, but vary from person to person or from culture to culture. Another prominent sophist, Gorgias, was renowned for his dazzling rhetorical displays. He boasted that he could argue any side of any question with equal conviction. In one famous exercise, he composed a speech defending Helen of Troy, the woman whose legendary beauty was said to have caused the Trojan War, arguing that she should not be blamed for her actions. Gorgias seemed to suggest that rhetoric was so powerful it could make any position seem reasonable, regardless of its actual merits. There were others too. Hippias prided himself on his encyclopedic knowledge and his ability to teach any subject. Prodicus specialized in the precise distinctions between words that seem similar, arguing that careful attention to language was essential for clear thinking. Thrasymachus, whom we meet in Plato's Republic, argued forcefully that justice was nothing more than the advantage of the stronger, that moral talk was merely a cover for power. These thinkers were diverse in their views and methods, but they shared a common interest in the practical arts of persuasion and success. Now, we must be careful here not to paint all the sophists with the same brush. They were a diverse group, and some of them made genuine contributions to logic, grammar, and social thought. But there was something about the sophistic movement that troubled many Athenians. If rhetoric could make the weaker argument appear the stronger, if truth was merely a matter of perspective, if virtue was simply whatever helped you get ahead, then what happened to genuine wisdom? What happened to real knowledge? What happened to the difference between right and wrong? It was into this intellectual ferment, this swirling mixture of pre-Socratic cosmology, sophistic relativism, and Athenian democracy, that a most unusual figure emerged. He was not handsome. In fact, by all accounts, he was quite the opposite. He had a broad, flat nose, bulging eyes, a thick neck, and a round belly. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, wearing the same worn cloak in summer and winter alike. He had no regular profession, no school, no systematic body of written teachings. He claimed to know nothing and to teach nothing. His name was Socrates. Socrates was born around the year 470 before the Common Era, the son of a stonemason named Sophroniscus and a midwife named Phaenarete. We know relatively little about his early life. He seems to have received the standard Athenian education in music, poetry, and gymnastics. He may have practiced his father's trade for a time. He served with distinction as a soldier in the Peloponnesian War, displaying remarkable courage and endurance in several battles. But by the time we encounter him in the accounts of his followers, Socrates had abandoned any regular occupation. Instead, he spent his days doing something that struck many of his contemporaries as very strange indeed. He wandered through the agora, the gymnasiums, and the private homes of Athens, and he talked. Or rather, he asked questions. Socrates would approach anyone, politicians, poets, craftsmen, wealthy aristocrats, young men eager to make their mark, and he would engage them in conversation. But these were not ordinary conversations. Socrates had a way of asking questions that seemed simple at first, almost naive, but that gradually led his conversation partners into deeper and more troubled waters. What is justice? He might ask a politician who prided himself on his knowledge of the law. What is courage? He would inquire of a general who had led men into battle. What is piety? He would demand of a priest on his way to make a sacrifice. What is beauty? He would wonder aloud to a poet who composed verses in praise of beautiful things. These seem like straightforward questions. Surely a just person knows what justice is. Surely a brave soldier understands courage. But as Socrates pressed his questions, something curious happened. The confident answers his companions offered at the start began to crumble. Contradictions emerged. Definitions that seemed obvious turned out to be incomplete or inconsistent, or to lead to absurd conclusions. By the end of these conversations, Socrates' interlocutors often found themselves in a state of puzzlement, unsure of what they thought they knew, uncertain of beliefs they had held their entire lives. And Socrates himself? He claimed to be just as puzzled as they were. "I know that I know nothing," he reportedly said, or something very close to it. This was not false modesty or rhetorical posturing. Socrates seemed genuinely convinced that he lacked the knowledge that others claimed to possess. The difference was that he was aware of his ignorance, while others were not. This brings us to one of the most famous stories about Socrates, the story of the oracle at Delphi. According to an account preserved in Plato's dialogue called the Apology, a friend of Socrates named Chaerephon once travelled to the sacred site of Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo, the Pythia, delivered prophecies on behalf of the god. Chaerephon asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle replied that no one was. When Socrates heard this, he was deeply puzzled. How could he, who knew nothing, be the wisest of all? So he set out to investigate. He went to the politicians who were reputed to be wise, and found that, although they thought themselves wise, they were not. He went to the poets, who composed beautiful verses, and found that they could not explain the meaning of their own works, creating by divine inspiration rather than knowledge. He went to the craftsmen, who genuinely knew their trades, but who assumed that their expertise in one area made them wise about everything else. And so Socrates came to understand what the oracle had meant. He was wiser than others, not because he possessed some special knowledge they lacked, but because he alone was aware of his own ignorance. The politicians, poets, and craftsmen all thought they knew things they did not actually know. Socrates, at least, did not suffer from this illusion. His wisdom consisted precisely in knowing the limits of his own understanding. This realization gave Socrates his mission. He came to believe that the god Apollo had given him a task: to examine his fellow citizens, to question their assumptions, to expose their false conceit of knowledge, and in doing so, to care for their souls. For Socrates believed that the unexamined life, the life lived without reflection, without questioning, without the pursuit of genuine understanding, was not worth living. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this moment, to appreciate how revolutionary this was. The pre-Socratic philosophers had turned their attention outward to the cosmos and its workings. The sophists had turned their attention to success, to rhetoric, persuasion, and getting ahead in the world. But Socrates turned his attention inward, to the soul and its condition. He asked not, "What are the stars made of?" but, "What does it mean to live a good life?" He asked not, "How can I win this argument?" but, "What is the truth of this matter?" And he developed a method for pursuing these questions, a way of thinking through dialogue, of examining beliefs through careful questioning, of testing ideas against reason and evidence. This method did not bear his name during his lifetime. He did not write books describing it or establish a school to teach it. But in the centuries after his death, as his followers struggled to preserve and understand his legacy, it came to be known as the Socratic Method. We stand now at the threshold of understanding this remarkable approach to truth and wisdom. In the ancient agora of Athens, amid the murmur of conversation and the soft rustle of sandals on stone, a new way of thinking was being born. It was not a system of answers, but an art of questions. It was not a doctrine to be memorized, but a practice to be lived. And its echoes, as we shall see, continue to resound through the corridors of human thought to this very day. But for now, let us simply rest with the image of that unusual figure, Socrates, barefoot and questioning, moving through the Athenian twilight in pursuit of something more precious than gold or power or fame. He sought wisdom, and he believed, with every fibre of his being, that the path to wisdom began with a simple, humble admission: "I do not know." Let that thought settle softly, like dust motes drifting in the fading light. For in the sections that follow, we shall explore more deeply what this method of questioning involves, how it works, and why it matters. But there is no hurry. The questions have waited for millennia. They can wait a little longer while we rest and breathe and prepare ourselves for the journey ahead. And so we return to our quiet contemplation, to the warm, lamp-lit study of ancient ideas. We have met Socrates now, that peculiar, barefoot philosopher who wandered through Athens asking questions. We have seen the world he inhabited, intellectual currents that swirled around him. But we have not yet looked closely at the method itself, at the particular way Socrates asked his questions, and why that way of asking proved so powerful and so enduring. Let us begin then with a simple question of our own. What exactly is the Socratic Method? At its heart, the Socratic Method is a form of cooperative dialogue between two or more people. One person, the questioner, asks a series of carefully chosen questions. The other person, the respondent, attempts to answer them. But unlike an ordinary conversation, where people simply exchange information or opinions, the Socratic dialogue has a specific purpose. It aims to examine beliefs, to test whether they are consistent and well-founded, and to move both participants closer to genuine understanding. The word that ancient Greeks used for this process was elenchus, which is sometimes translated as refutation or cross-examination. But these translations can be misleading. The elenchus was not primarily about proving someone wrong or winning an argument. Its deeper purpose was to expose hidden contradictions in a person's beliefs, to reveal assumptions they did not know they were making, and to clear away false opinions so that genuine knowledge might have room to grow. Imagine for a moment a garden that has become overgrown with weeds. You cannot simply plant new seeds in such a garden and expect them to flourish. First, you must pull up the weeds, turn over the soil, and prepare the ground for new growth. The elenchus performs a similar function for the mind. It clears away the tangled undergrowth of unexamined beliefs, creating space for clearer, more coherent understanding to emerge. Let us look more closely at how this process works. A typical Socratic dialogue begins with a question about the nature or definition of something. What is courage? Socrates might ask. What is friendship? What is knowledge? These are not questions about particular instances. Not, was Achilles courageous when he faced Hector? Or, is this person my friend? But questions about the essence of the thing itself. What makes any act courageous? What makes any relationship a friendship? What distinguishes knowledge from mere opinion? The respondent, usually someone who considers themselves knowledgeable about the topic, offers a definition. Perhaps a military general, asked about courage, replies that courage is standing firm in battle and not running away from the enemy. This seems like a reasonable answer. After all, the general has spent his life on battlefields, and he has seen many acts of courage and cowardice. Surely he knows what courage is. But Socrates does not accept the definition immediately. Instead, he begins to probe it with further questions. Is courage only found in battle? He might ask. What about the courage of a person who faces a terrible illness with dignity? What about the courage of someone who speaks an unpopular truth, knowing they will be mocked or punished? Are these not also examples of courage, even though they have nothing to do with armies and enemies? The general must admit that yes, these two seem like examples of courage. But now his definition is in trouble. He said courage was standing firm in battle, but clearly courage can exist outside of battle. His definition was too narrow. It did not capture all the instances of the thing he was trying to define. So the general tries again. Perhaps courage, he now suggests, is endurance, the ability to persist in the face of difficulty, whether on the battlefield or elsewhere. But Socrates presses further. Is all endurance courage? He asks. What about someone who persists stubbornly in a foolish course of action? refusing to retreat even when retreat is clearly the wiser choice. Is that courage, or is it mere recklessness? And what about someone who endures terrible suffering in pursuit of an evil goal? Would we call that courage, or something else entirely? The general finds himself uncertain. He can see that not all endurance is admirable, that there is a difference between wise persistence and foolish stubbornness, that the goodness of courage seems connected to the goodness of the ends it serves. But now his simple definition has become complicated. He thought he knew what courage was, but under Socrates' questioning, that confident knowledge has dissolved into puzzlement. This state of puzzlement, this experience of recognizing that one does not know what one thought one knew, has a special name in Greek, aporia. The word literally means something like pathlessness or being at a loss. It describes the condition of someone who has followed a road they thought would lead somewhere, only to find themselves in trackless wilderness, uncertain which way to turn. In ordinary life, aporia is uncomfortable. We do not like feeling confused or uncertain. We prefer the solid ground of confident belief, even if that belief is mistaken. But for Socrates, aporia was not a failure. It was an achievement. It was the first essential step on the path to genuine wisdom. Why would Socrates consider confusion a form of progress? Because, in his view, the greatest obstacle to learning is the belief that one already knows. If you think you understand something perfectly, you will not investigate it further. You will not question your assumptions or examine your evidence. You will rest content with your false knowledge, never realizing how much you are missing. But once you recognize your ignorance, once you truly feel the discomfort of aporia, then, and only then, are you ready to begin the genuine search for understanding. Socrates compared himself to a gadfly, a stinging insect that pestered the great, lazy horse of Athens, keeping it from dozing and forcing it to stay alert. His questions were meant to sting, to disturb, to awaken his fellow citizens from their intellectual slumber. This was not cruelty on his part, but a form of care. He believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, and he saw his role as helping others examine their lives, even when the examination was uncomfortable. There was another image Socrates used to describe his work, one that connects beautifully to his family history. His mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife, someone who helped women give birth to children. Socrates claimed that he, too, was a kind of midwife, but one who helped people give birth to ideas. In a passage from Plato's dialogue called the Theaetetus, Socrates explains this analogy in detail. Just as midwives do not themselves give birth, but assist others in labour, Socrates claimed that he had no wisdom of his own to offer, but could help others bring forth the wisdom that was already within them. Just as midwives can recognize whether a child is healthy or defective, Socrates could examine the ideas his companions produced and determine whether they were true and viable or false and stillborn. And just as midwives ply their trade only after they themselves have passed the age of childbearing, Socrates believed that his own inability to produce positive doctrines was precisely what qualified him to assist others in their intellectual labor. This image of the midwife illuminates an important aspect of Socratic questioning. Socrates did not simply tell people what to think. He did not lecture or pronounce or hand down truths from on high. Instead, he drew out what was already present, helping his conversation partners articulate and examine their own beliefs. The process was collaborative, even intimate. Both questioner and respondent were engaged in a shared search for understanding, and whatever insights emerged belonged to both of them. Now, there is another feature of Socrates' approach that we must understand, one that has fascinated and sometimes frustrated readers for more than 2,000 years. This is what scholars call Socratic irony. When Socrates approached a politician, a poet, or a general, He did not announce that he was there to expose their ignorance. He did not stride up to them with an air of superiority, declaring that their beliefs were confused and their definitions inadequate. Instead, he presented himself as an eager student, genuinely curious to learn from their expertise. "You are a general," he might say, "and you have spent your life studying and practicing the art of war. Surely you can explain to me what courage is, for I am ignorant and wish to learn." This humble, self-deprecating posture was the irony. Socrates knew perfectly well that his questions would lead to difficulties. He knew that the confident expert would soon find himself tangled in contradictions. But he approached the conversation as if he did not know, as if he genuinely expected to receive the wisdom he claimed to seek. Was this deceptive? Was it a kind of game Socrates played for his own amusement? Scholars have debated these questions at length, and reasonable people disagree. Perhaps the most charitable interpretation is that Socratic irony was itself a form of teaching. By pretending to be the student, Socrates encouraged his conversation partners to take the role of teacher, which meant they had to try to articulate clearly and defend rigorously the beliefs they claimed to hold. In doing so, they discovered for themselves the inadequacy of those beliefs. The lesson was more powerful because it came from within, because they had experienced the contradictions firsthand rather than simply being told about them. Let us pause here to look at a specific example, drawn from one of Plato's early dialogues. The dialogue is called the Euthyphro, and it takes place just before Socrates' trial on charges of impiety. Socrates encounters a man named Euthyphro, a religious expert who is on his way to court to prosecute his own father for murder. Socrates expresses surprise that Euthyphro would take such a drastic step, and Euthyphro explains that he is doing his religious duty, that piety requires him to pursue justice even against his own family. Socrates seizes on this. "You must be very wise in religious matters," he says, with characteristic irony, "to be so confident that you are doing the right thing. Please teach me what piety is, so that I might use this knowledge in my own defense." Euthyphro offers his first definition. Piety is doing what he is doing now, prosecuting wrongdoers regardless of who they are. But Socrates points out that this is merely an example, not a definition. He wants to know what piety itself is, the quality that makes any pious act pious. Euthyphro tries again. Piety is what is dear to the gods. This seems better, a general definition rather than a specific example. But Socrates asks a troubling question. The Greek gods, as portrayed in mythology, often disagreed with one another. They had different favorites, different values, different agendas. So something might be dear to one god, but hateful to another. Does this mean the same action could be both pious and impious? Euthyphro adjusts his definition. Piety is what all the gods love, and impiety is what all the gods hate. But now Socrates poses what has become one of the most famous questions in the history of philosophy. He asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? This may sound like a subtle distinction, but its implications are profound. If the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, then there must be some standard of piety independent of the gods' preferences, something that makes certain actions pious and causes the gods to love them. In that case, we cannot define piety simply as what the gods love. We need to identify this independent standard. But if, on the other hand, something is pious merely because the gods happen to love it, then piety seems arbitrary, a matter of divine whim rather than genuine goodness. Neither option is comfortable for someone like Euthyphro, who wants to believe that piety is both grounded in divine authority and genuinely good. The dialogue continues. with Euthyphro attempting several more definitions and Socrates finding difficulties with each one. By the end, no satisfactory answer has been reached. Euthyphro, suddenly remembering an urgent appointment, hurries away, leaving Socrates no better informed about piety than he was at the start. This is typical of Plato's early dialogues, the ones that most scholars believe capture Socrates' actual method and concerns. They end in aporia, in puzzlement rather than resolution. No positive doctrine is established. No definition survives Socratic scrutiny. The reader, like the participants in the dialogue, is left with questions rather than answers. Let us consider another example, drawn from the dialogue called the Meno. In this conversation, a wealthy young man named Meno asks Socrates whether virtue can be taught. Socrates, characteristically, responds by saying that he cannot answer this question because he does not even know what virtue is. "How can I know whether something can be taught?" he asks, "when I do not know what that thing is in the first place?" Meno is surprised. Surely everyone knows what virtue is, so he offers a definition. Virtue is the ability to rule over others. But Socrates points out that this cannot be the whole story. Can a slave have virtue? A slave does not rule over anyone, yet we might still call a slave virtuous if they possess good qualities of character. And what about women and children? Are they virtuous only if they rule? Surely virtue must be something broader than political power. Meno tries again, listing various virtues. The virtue of a man is to manage public affairs. The virtue of a woman is to manage the household, and so on for each type of person. But Socrates wants to know what all these virtues have in common. "You have given me a swarm of virtues," he says, "when I asked for just one." The definition must capture the essence that makes all virtuous things virtuous, not simply enumerate examples. As the dialogue progresses, Meno becomes frustrated. He poses what has become known as the learner's paradox. How can we inquire into something we do not know? If we do not know what virtue is, how will we recognize it when we find it? And if we already know, why do we need to inquire? Socrates responds with one of the most famous passages in all of Plato's writings. He suggests that learning is actually a form of recollection, that the soul, before birth, knew all truths, and that what we call learning is really the process of remembering what we once knew but have forgotten. To demonstrate this, he calls over one of Meno's enslaved servants, a boy who has never been taught geometry, and through careful questioning, without ever telling the boy any mathematical facts, leads him to discover a geometrical truth about how to double the area of a square. This famous scene, sometimes called the slave boy demonstration, illustrates something important about the Socratic method. The boy does not learn geometry from Socrates in the sense of being told facts he must memorize. Instead, through questions alone, he is led to see relationships and draw conclusions for himself. The knowledge, Socrates suggests, was somehow already present within him. It needed only to be drawn out through the right kind of inquiry. Whether we accept Socrates' metaphysical theory of recollection or not, the pedagogical point remains powerful. People learn most deeply when they discover things for themselves, when they actively engage with problems rather than passively receiving solutions. The teacher's role on this model is not to pour knowledge into empty vessels, but to ask the questions that help students find the knowledge within themselves. This can be frustrating for modern readers who want clear conclusions and practical takeaways, but the frustration may itself be part of the point. The Socratic method is not designed to provide easy answers. It is designed to provoke thought, to unsettle complacency, to keep the inquiry alive. The questions matter more than the answers, because the questions keep us thinking, keep us examining, keep us alive to the complexity and mystery of the concepts we use every day. There is one more aspect of the Socratic method we should consider before moving on, and that is how it differs from debate or argument in the ordinary sense. In a debate, the goal is typically to win, to defeat your opponent, to make your position appear stronger than theirs, to persuade the audience that you are right and they are wrong. The sophists excelled at this kind of competitive rhetoric. They could argue any side of any question, and they trained their students to do the same. But Socratic dialogue has a different aim. It is not about winning or losing. It is about truth. Both participants are, in principle, engaged in a shared search for understanding. The questioner is not trying to defeat the respondent, but to help them examine their beliefs more carefully. The respondent is not trying to defend a position at all costs, but to discover whether that position is actually correct. If the dialogue reveals that a belief is false or confused, this is not a defeat for the person who held that belief. It is progress, a step away from error and toward truth. Of course, not every Socratic conversation achieved this ideal. Some of Socrates' interlocutors grew angry or resentful when their confident beliefs were undermined. Some accused Socrates of mere trickery, of using clever words to make good arguments look bad. And Socrates himself was not always a model of patience and humility. There are moments in Plato's dialogues where he seems to enjoy his interlocutor's discomfort a bit too much, where his irony shades into mockery. But at its best, Socratic questioning creates a space for genuine intellectual growth. It invites us to hold our beliefs lightly, to remain open to revision and refinement, to value truth more than the comfort of certainty. It reminds us that the wisest response to many of life's deepest questions is not confident assertion, but humble inquiry. And so, we have now surveyed the essential features of the Socratic method: the focus on definitions and essences, the technique of elenchus or cross-examination, the role of aporia or puzzlement, the midwife analogy, the function of irony, and the distinction between dialogue and debate. These are the tools Socrates used in his lifelong pursuit of wisdom, the techniques he deployed in countless conversations across the streets and gathering places of Athens. In the next section, we shall delve deeper into the philosophy that underlies these techniques, the beliefs about knowledge, virtue, and the human soul that made Socrates think this kind of questioning was so important. But for now, let us rest with what we have learned, letting the ideas settle like sediment in still water, allowing understanding to clarify slowly in the quiet depths of the mind. The questions are patient. They have waited for centuries. They can wait a little longer while we pause and breathe and prepare for the next stage of our journey together, as if returning to a familiar hearth after a brief walk. We have watched Socrates in action now, seen him weave his careful questions through the minds of his fellow Athenians. We have observed the technique, examined the tools, but we have not yet fully understood why Socrates believed this method of questioning was so important, what he thought it could accomplish, and what vision of human life and human excellence lay behind his relentless pursuit of definitions. To understand the philosophy behind the Socratic method, we must explore several interconnected ideas. Socrates' peculiar views about knowledge and ignorance, his conviction that an examined life is essential to human flourishing, his beliefs about the relationship between virtue and knowledge, and his profound concern for the health and well-being of the soul. Let us begin with that famous statement we encountered earlier: "I know that I know nothing." This declaration, or something very close to it, appears in Plato's Apology, where Socrates is defending himself against the charges that will lead to his execution. It has puzzled readers for millennia. How can someone know that they know nothing? Is this not itself a claim to knowledge, and therefore self-contradictory? The apparent paradox dissolves when we understand what Socrates meant by knowledge. He was not talking about everyday practical knowledge. the kind of knowledge a craftsman has of his trade, or the kind of knowledge that tells us it is raining when we feel water on our faces. Socrates freely admitted that people could have this sort of knowledge. The shoemaker knows how to make shoes. The pilot knows how to navigate a ship. The mathematician knows how to calculate areas and angles. What Socrates denied having was a different kind of knowledge. Wisdom about the most important matters of human life. What is justice? What is goodness? What is the best way to live? How should we treat one another? What happens to us after death? These are the questions that Socrates pursued, and these are the questions about which he professed ignorance. His claim was not that such knowledge was impossible, but that he had not attained it, and that others who claimed to have attained it were mistaken. The politicians thought they knew what justice was, but under examination, their definitions crumbled. The poets thought they understood beauty and virtue, but they could not explain the meaning of their own words. The religious authorities thought they knew what the gods wanted, but their accounts of piety were confused and contradictory. Socrates' insight was that most people live in a state of false confidence. They use words like justice and courage and goodness every day, and they assume they understand what these words mean. But when pressed, they discover that their understanding is superficial at best and often incoherent. They have opinions, not knowledge. They have beliefs they have never examined, assumptions they have never questioned, convictions they have inherited from their culture without ever testing them against reason. This distinction between knowledge and opinion was central to Socratic philosophy. True knowledge for Socrates had to be defensible. It had to be able to withstand questioning, to survive cross-examination, to be articulated clearly and consistently. An opinion, by contrast, was merely something one happened to believe, perhaps because one had been told it, or because it felt right, or because everyone else seemed to believe it. Opinions might be true, but they were not secure. They could not be relied upon when the pressure was on. Now we can understand why the Socratic method focused so intensely on definitions. When Socrates asked, "What is courage?" he was asking his interlocutors to move beyond their vague, unreflective opinions and to articulate a clear, defensible understanding of what courage really is. The process of trying to formulate such a definition and discovering how difficult it is was meant to reveal the difference between genuine knowledge and mere opinion. But why did Socrates think this kind of intellectual clarity mattered so much? Could we not live perfectly well with our vague opinions and unexamined beliefs? Many people do, after all, and they seem to get along fine. What was so important about subjecting one's beliefs to rigorous questioning? The answer lies in Socrates' famous declaration that the unexamined life is not worth living. This statement appears in the Apology at the moment when Socrates is explaining why he cannot simply stop philosophizing, even if doing so would save his life. He tells the jury that if they were to release him on the condition that he cease his questioning, he would have to refuse. For him, a life without inquiry, without the pursuit of wisdom, without the constant effort to understand oneself and one's world more deeply, would be no life at all. This is a remarkably strong claim. Socrates was not saying merely that the examined life is better, or more pleasant, or more successful than the unexamined life. He was saying that the unexamined life is not worth living, that without reflection and inquiry, human existence loses its essential meaning and value. To understand why Socrates believed this, we need to appreciate how he thought about human beings and their unique place in the world. For Socrates, what distinguished humans from other animals was our capacity for reason, our ability to think, to reflect, to question, to understand. A cow or a dog lives by instinct and appetite, responding to the stimuli of the moment without ever asking why. But human beings can step back from their immediate impulses and ask, is this the right thing to do? What do I really want? What kind of person do I want to be? This capacity for reflection is, in Socrates' view, what makes human life potentially meaningful. To live as a human being is not merely to eat and drink and reproduce and survive. It is to engage with the world thoughtfully, to seek understanding, to pursue wisdom, to become more fully the rational creatures we have the potential to be. A person who never exercises this capacity, who drifts through life without ever questioning their beliefs or examining their values, is, in a sense, not living a fully human life. They are living more like an animal, or perhaps like a machine, going through the motions without ever waking up to the deeper possibilities of their existence. But Socrates' concern for the examined life was not merely about intellectual curiosity or the pleasures of philosophical discussion. It was fundamentally about ethics, about how to live well and how to be a good person. This brings us to one of the most distinctive and controversial aspects of Socratic philosophy, the idea that virtue is knowledge. What did Socrates mean by this? He seems to have believed that if you truly know what is good, you will do it. If you genuinely understand what courage is, you will be courageous. If you have real knowledge of justice, you will act justly. Vice and wrongdoing, on this view, are always the result of ignorance. People do bad things not because they are wicked by nature, but because they do not truly understand what is good. This is sometimes called the Socratic paradox, because it seems to conflict with common experience. We often feel that we know perfectly well what the right thing to do is, but we choose to do the wrong thing anyway. We know we should not eat the extra slice of cake, but we eat it. We know we should be patient with our children, but we lose our temper. We know we should keep our promises, but we break them when it becomes inconvenient. How can Socrates claim that all wrongdoing is ignorance, when it so often seems to be weakness of will? Socrates' response, as far as we can reconstruct it from Plato's dialogues, was that in these cases, we do not really know what we think we know. We may have a superficial opinion that the cake is bad for us, but we do not have genuine knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is fully integrated into our understanding and that cannot be overridden by momentary desire. If we truly, deeply understood how bad the cake was for us, if we grasp this truth with the same clarity with which we grasp that fire burns and knives cut, we would not be tempted to eat it. Our yielding to temptation is proof that our knowledge was not genuine, not complete, not truly ours. This view has profound implications for how we think about moral education. If virtue is knowledge, then becoming a good person is fundamentally an intellectual task. It requires learning, not learning facts about the world, but learning to understand oneself, to grasp what is truly good and truly bad, to see through the illusions and confusions that lead us astray. And this is precisely what the Socratic Method is designed to facilitate. By questioning our beliefs about courage, justice, piety, and the good life, we gradually clarify our understanding and move closer to the genuine knowledge that will make us virtuous. There is another piece of Socratic philosophy we must consider here, and that is his emphasis on the soul. The Greek word is psyche, and for Socrates, it referred to something like the essential self, the part of us that thinks and feels and chooses, the part that makes us who we really are. Today we might use words like mind or self or character, though none of these captures exactly what Socrates meant. Socrates believed that caring for the soul was the most important task in human life. More important than wealth, more important than pleasure, more important than reputation or political power. All these external goods were worthless, in his view, if the soul was corrupt or confused? What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul, as a later tradition would put it? Socrates would have agreed entirely with this sentiment, though he would have phrased it in different terms. And what did it mean to care for the soul? It meant, above all, to pursue wisdom, to examine one's beliefs, to question one's values, to seek genuine understanding of what is good and true and beautiful. The Socratic method was not merely an intellectual exercise or a clever form of argument. It was a spiritual practice, a discipline for the cultivation of the soul. Each questioning conversation was an opportunity for moral and intellectual growth, a chance to clear away false beliefs and move closer to the wisdom that would make one truly virtuous and truly happy. Yes, truly happy. For Socrates believed that there was a deep connection between virtue, wisdom, and happiness. The Greek word for happiness or flourishing is eudaimonia, and it refers not to a momentary feeling of pleasure, but to a life that is going well overall, a life that is fulfilling and complete. Socrates seems to have believed that the virtuous person, the person with genuine wisdom about how to live, would necessarily be happy, regardless of external circumstances. This is another aspect of Socratic philosophy that strikes many people as counterintuitive. Surely happiness depends on more than virtue. Surely we need health, friends, material resources, and good fortune to be truly happy. How could Socrates claim that wisdom alone was sufficient for eudaimonia? His reasoning seems to have been something like this. Most of the things we pursue in life, money, power, pleasure, reputation, we pursue because we think they will make us happy. But we are often wrong about this. We get the things we wanted and find that they do not satisfy us, or we discover that they bring new problems and anxieties in their wake. External goods are unreliable. They can be taken away by chance or circumstance. The only thing that cannot be taken from us is our own wisdom and virtue, the condition of our soul. And if we have achieved true wisdom, we will understand what is genuinely good and how to respond to whatever life brings us. We will be self-sufficient in the deepest sense, needing nothing outside ourselves to live well. As if thinking aloud. Whether Socrates was right about all this remains a matter of debate. His views about virtue and knowledge and happiness were developed and modified by later philosophers, including his most famous student Plato and Plato's student Aristotle. Some aspects of Socratic ethics seem profound and insightful. Others seem exaggerated or incomplete. But even where we disagree with Socrates, we can appreciate the seriousness and consistency of his vision. He believed that the most important thing in life was to understand how to live well, and he devoted his entire existence to pursuing and sharing that understanding. Now we can see more fully why the Socratic method mattered so much to Socrates himself. It was not a mere intellectual game or a technique for winning arguments. It was a way of caring for the soul, his own soul, and the souls of his fellow citizens. Every question he asked was an invitation to examine, to reflect, to grow. Every dialogue was an opportunity for both participants to move closer to the wisdom that Socrates believed was the key to virtue and happiness. The image that emerges is of philosophy not as an academic discipline, but as a way of life. Socrates did not merely think about philosophical questions, he lived them. His poverty, his indifference to physical comfort, his willingness to face death rather than abandon his mission, all of these were expressions of his philosophical convictions. He believed that the soul was more important than the body, that wisdom was more valuable than wealth, and that the pursuit of truth was worth any sacrifice. In the cool evening air of ancient Athens, as the stars emerged above the agora and the conversations wound down, Socrates would make his way home, his mind still turning over the questions of the day. What is justice? What is goodness? How should one live? These questions had no final answers, at least none that Socrates could claim with confidence. But the asking of them, the tireless, relentless inquiry, this was for him the essence of the philosophical life. This was what it meant to be truly human. And so, the philosophy behind the Socratic Method is ultimately a philosophy of human flourishing. It says that we are beings capable of reason and reflection, and that our highest good lies in exercising these capacities. It says that genuine knowledge of what is good will make us good, and that the pursuit of such knowledge is the most important task we can undertake. It says that the soul is more precious than any external possession, and that caring for the soul means questioning, examining, and never resting content with unexamined opinions. These are rich and demanding ideas. They ask much of us, perhaps more than most of us are willing to give. But even if we do not follow Socrates all the way, even if we find some of his views too extreme or too optimistic, we can still learn from his example. We can still practice the art of questioning, still examine our beliefs and values, still make time for the kind of reflection that Socrates believed was essential to a life worth living. For now, let these ideas rest gently in the mind, like seeds planted in fertile soil. We have explored the philosophy, we have seen the vision of human life that animated Socrates' questioning. In the next section, we shall trace the legacy of this vision, how it was preserved and transformed by later thinkers, and how it continues to influence our world today. But there is no hurry. The wisdom Socrates sought is patient. It waits for us, as it has waited for countless seekers across the ages. Rest now and breathe. The journey continues when you are ready. We have walked now through the streets of ancient Athens with Socrates. We have watched him question, seen him probe, understood something of the philosophy that drove his tireless inquiry. But our story is not yet complete. For the ideas Socrates planted in those long-ago conversations did not die with him. They grew and spread, branching out through centuries and civilizations, shaping the way human beings think about thought itself. To understand this legacy, we must first confront a profound irony. The man who claimed to know nothing, who insisted that the unexamined life was not worth living, who spent his days in philosophical conversation rather than writing books. This man was put to death by the very city he loved. In the year 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was about 70 years old, he was brought to trial before an Athenian jury of 500 citizens. The charges against him were twofold: impiety, failing to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledged, and introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth. Both charges were serious, and both carry the possibility of the death penalty. The historical context helps us understand why Socrates had become so controversial. Athens had recently emerged from a devastating period of political turmoil. The city had lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, and in the aftermath, a group of oligarchs known as the 30 Tyrants had briefly seized power, terrorizing the population before democracy was restored. Some of the men associated with the 30 had been students or companions of Socrates, including his former associate Critias, who was among the most brutal of the tyrants. Socrates himself had no involvement in the crimes of the 30, and he had actually defied their orders on at least one occasion. But his association with such men, combined with his long history of questioning democratic politicians and challenging conventional beliefs, made him a target for those who wanted someone to blame for Athens' troubles. The restored democracy was nervous, defensive, eager to reassert traditional values and punish anyone who seemed to threaten the social order. The trial of Socrates is preserved for us in fictionalized form in Plato's dialogue called the Apology. The word apology here does not mean an expression of regret. It comes from the Greek apologia, meaning a defense speech. In this dialogue, Plato presents his version of what Socrates said to the jury in his own defense. It is a remarkable document. Socrates does not grovel or plead for mercy. He does not claim to be innocent of the charges in any technical sense. Instead, he explains his life and his mission, reaffirming his commitment to philosophical inquiry and insisting that what his accusers call corruption is actually the greatest service one can render to one's fellow citizens. He tells the jury that he will not stop philosophizing, even if they threaten him with death, because a life without examination is not worth living. The jury found him guilty by a relatively narrow margin, perhaps 280 votes to 220. Under Athenian law, the prosecution and defense each proposed a penalty, and the jury chose between them. The prosecution asked for death. Socrates, in what seems like deliberate provocation, initially proposed that his penalty should be free meals at the public expense, like an Olympic victor. He eventually suggested a small fine, but by then, the jury was not in a forgiving mood. They voted for death. Socrates spent about a month in prison before his execution, as the Athenians were observing a religious festival during which no executions could take place. During this time, according to Plato, he continued to converse with his friends and followers about philosophy, about the soul, about the afterlife, about how one should face death. When the time came, he drank the poison hemlock calmly, even cheerfully, and died surrounded by those who loved him. The death of Socrates became one of the defining moments in Western intellectual history. Here was a man who had devoted his life to the pursuit of wisdom and the care of the soul, put to death by a democratic city for the crime of asking questions. The injustice of it, the nobility of Socrates' response, the image of the philosopher facing death with equanimity, all of this burned itself into the consciousness of subsequent generations. But Socrates left no writings of his own. Everything we know about him comes from others, primarily from his student Plato, but also from the historian Xenophon, the playwright Aristophanes, and, much later, from the philosopher Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's. These sources often disagree with one another, and scholars continue to debate which, if any, gives us an accurate picture of the historical Socrates. It was Plato who did the most to preserve and transmit Socrates' legacy. Plato was about 28 years old when Socrates died, and the shock of that death seems to have shaped his entire philosophical career. He founded a school in Athens called the Academy, often considered the first university in the Western world, and he wrote a series of dialogues in which Socrates appears as the main character, questioning other thinkers and exploring philosophical problems. Plato's early dialogues, like the Euthyphro we discussed earlier, are generally thought to reflect the historical Socrates' methods and concerns relatively accurately. They are short, they focus on ethical questions, they typically end in aporia without reaching positive conclusions, and they showcase the elenchus in action. But as Plato's career progressed, his dialogues became longer and more ambitious, and the character of Socrates began to expound positive doctrines, the theory of forms, detailed accounts of the soul and its parts, elaborate political philosophies that go well beyond anything the historical Socrates is likely to have taught. This creates what scholars call the Socratic problem. How do we distinguish the ideas of the historical Socrates from the ideas Plato put into his mouth? The honest answer is that we cannot be certain. But most scholars agree that the Socratic method itself, the practice of questioning, the pursuit of definitions, the use of elenchus to expose contradictions, is genuinely Socratic, preserved by Plato out of devotion to his teacher's memory. Plato developed and transformed the Socratic inheritance in his own distinctive ways. Where Socrates had focused primarily on ethical questions, what is virtue? How should one live? Plato expanded the inquiry to encompass metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, political philosophy, and aesthetics. He proposed his famous theory of forms, which held that the concepts Socrates had sought to define, justice, beauty, goodness, courage, existed as eternal, unchanging realities in a realm beyond the physical world. The particular just acts we encounter in daily life are just because they participate in or imitate the form of justice. The beautiful things we see are beautiful because they reflect the form of beauty. Whether Socrates himself would have accepted this theory is uncertain. There are hints in some early dialogues that he was moving in this direction, but the full-blown Platonic metaphysics goes far beyond anything clearly attributable to Socrates. What Plato preserved, more than any specific doctrine, was the spirit of Socratic inquiry, the conviction that philosophy is a matter of asking questions, testing answers, and following the argument wherever it leads. Plato's student Aristotle took the tradition in yet another direction. Aristotle spent 20 years at the academy before eventually founding his own school, the Lyceum. He had enormous respect for both Socrates and Plato, but he was also willing to criticize them where he thought they had gone wrong. "Plato is dear to me," he reportedly said, "but truth is dearer still." Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms, arguing that universal concepts do not exist in some separate realm, but are present in the particular things we encounter in the world. He also modified the Socratic doctrine that virtue is knowledge, suggesting that practical wisdom, which the Greeks called phronesis, involved not just knowing what is good, but also having the right habits and emotional dispositions to act on that knowledge. Aristotle recognized what we might call weakness of will, the phenomenon of knowing what is right but failing to do it, as a genuine psychological reality, not merely a sign of incomplete knowledge. Yet even as he departed from Socrates on specific points, Aristotle preserved and developed the practice of careful philosophical inquiry. His writings are full of careful distinctions, systematic analyses, and the patient examination of alternative views. The questioning spirit of Socrates lives on in Aristotle, even when the specific questions have changed. After Aristotle, the Socratic method continued to influence the various schools of Hellenistic philosophy that flourished in the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquests. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 before the Common Era, traced their intellectual lineage back through Socrates and emphasized many Socratic themes: the importance of virtue, the cultivation of inner tranquility, the idea that wisdom is the key to happiness. The Stoic practice of examining one's judgments and impressions, asking whether our initial reactions to events are rational and well-founded, echoes the Socratic examination of beliefs. The Epicureans too, though they differed from Socrates on many points, valued philosophical inquiry as the path to a good life. Epicurus taught that philosophy was medicine for the soul, that careful reasoning about the nature of things could free us from irrational fears and unnecessary desires. The four-part cure he offered: do not fear the gods, do not fear death, good things are easy to obtain, suffering is easy to endure, required philosophical examination to grasp and apply. The skeptics, too, drew on the Socratic tradition, though they took the lesson of aporia in a more radical direction. If every attempt to define virtue or knowledge or justice ends in puzzlement, perhaps the appropriate response is to suspend judgment entirely, neither affirming nor denying, but maintaining a state of peaceful uncertainty. the skeptics developed sophisticated techniques for generating equally balanced arguments on both sides of any question, a kind of generalized elenchus designed to produce not wisdom, but tranquility through the absence of commitment. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic and studied by Muslim scholars who developed their own rich traditions of commentary and interpretation. The Socratic method influenced figures like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Rushd, who wrestled with the relationship between reason and revelation, and who saw in Socratic questioning a model for rigorous intellectual inquiry. In medieval Europe, the recovery of Aristotle's works, often via Arabic translations, sparked a renaissance of philosophical and theological thinking. Scholars in the emerging universities developed sophisticated methods of disputation, in which students would argue different sides of a question and masters would offer resolutions. These scholastic debates, while more formal and structured than Socratic dialogue, drew on the same spirit of careful questioning and the systematic examination of alternatives. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century theologian, organized his monumental Summa Theologiae as a series of questions, with objections, counter-arguments, and replies. Each article begins by considering the strongest arguments against the position Aquinas will ultimately defend, a kind of internal elenchus that ensures all perspectives are given their due. This structure, while different from Platonic dialogue, reflects the ongoing influence of the Socratic conviction that truth emerges through the careful examination of competing views. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in the original texts of Plato and the historical Socrates. Humanist scholars translated the Platonic dialogues into Latin and the vernacular languages, making them accessible to a wider audience. The figure of Socrates became a cultural icon, the archetypal philosopher, the martyr for free thought, the gadfly who stirred the sleeping horse of society. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries saw themselves as heirs to the Socratic tradition of rational inquiry. Thinkers like Locke, Hume, and Kant emphasized the importance of subjecting traditional beliefs to critical examination, of not accepting ideas merely because they were old or widely held. The Socratic motto, "Know thyself," inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, became a watchword for the Enlightenment project of self-understanding through reason. In more recent times, the Socratic method has found its way into numerous practical contexts. Perhaps the most famous is legal education, particularly in American law schools. The case method, pioneered at Harvard Law School in the late 19th century by Christopher Columbus Langdell and developed further by others, involves professors questioning students about assigned court cases, pushing them to articulate and defend their interpretations, exposing weaknesses in their reasoning, and forcing them to think through the implications of legal principles. If you have seen films or read novels set in law schools, you may have encountered scenes where a professor calls on a student without warning and subjects them to a relentless series of questions. What were the facts of the case? What did the court hold? Why? What if the facts were different in this way? Would the holding change? Why or why not? This pedagogical style, sometimes called the Socratic Method with a lowercase m, aims to develop the skills of careful analysis, clear articulation, and rigorous reasoning that lawyers need in their professional work. Whether this adversarial, often intimidating classroom style truly captures the spirit of Socratic dialogue is debatable. Socrates, after all, claimed to be a fellow seeker rather than an expert testing students. But the underlying idea that genuine understanding comes through questioning and examination rather than passive reception of information is genuinely Socratic. Beyond legal education, the Socratic method has influenced pedagogy more broadly. Progressive educators in the 20th century inspired by thinkers like John Dewey, emphasized the importance of active learning, student engagement, and critical thinking over rote memorization. Discussion-based classrooms, seminar-style instruction, and inquiry-based learning all draw, to varying degrees, on the Socratic insight that students learn best when they are actively wrestling with ideas rather than passively absorbing them. One of the most striking modern applications of Socratic questioning appears in psychotherapy, particularly in the approach known as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Developed in the mid-20th century by figures like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, CBT is based on the idea that psychological distress often stems from distorted or irrational beliefs. A person suffering from depression might believe, "I am worthless," or "nothing ever works out for me." A person with anxiety might think, "Something terrible is about to happen," or "I cannot cope with uncertainty." The therapist's task in CBT is to help the client examine these beliefs, to question them, test them against evidence, consider alternative interpretations, and ultimately replace distorted thinking with more realistic and adaptive patterns. This process is explicitly Socratic. The therapist does not simply tell the client that their beliefs are wrong. Instead, through careful questioning, the therapist guides the client to discover the inadequacy of their beliefs for themselves. What is the evidence for this belief? The therapist might ask. What is the evidence against it? Are there alternative ways of interpreting the situation? What would you say to a friend who had this thought? What are the consequences of holding this belief? These questions echo the elenchus. They invite examination, expose inconsistencies, and create space for new understanding to emerge. Research has shown that CBT is effective for a wide range of psychological conditions, including depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. The success of this approach suggests that there is something powerful about the Socratic method of guided questioning. Something that helps people not just intellectually, but emotionally and practically, enabling them to live better lives. And so, the legacy of Socrates extends far beyond the groves of the academy or the pages of philosophy textbooks. It lives in courtrooms and classrooms, in therapy sessions and boardrooms, wherever people gather to think together, to question assumptions, to pursue understanding through dialogue. The barefoot philosopher of Athens, who claimed to know nothing and asked only questions, set in motion a tradition of inquiry that continues to shape human thought and human lives more than 2,000 years after his death. There is something deeply moving about this continuity. The specific questions Socrates asked, what is piety, what is courage, may seem remote from our contemporary concerns, but the practice of questioning, the commitment to examination, the conviction that truth emerges through dialogue, and that wisdom begins with the recognition of ignorance, these remain as vital and as necessary as ever. In a world awash with information and opinion, where confident assertions fill our screens and certainty is worn as a badge of tribal loyalty, the Socratic example offers a different path. It invites us to slow down, to ask questions, to listen carefully to the answers, and to follow the argument wherever it leads. It reminds us that the most important truths are often the hardest to articulate, and that genuine understanding requires patience, humility, and the willingness to be proven wrong. The legacy of Socrates is not a body of doctrine or a set of correct answers. It is an invitation to join the conversation, to take up the questions, to continue the search that Socrates began in the streets of ancient Athens. That search has no final destination, no moment of complete arrival. It is itself the point, the practice, the way of living that Socrates believed was essential to human flourishing. Rest now and let these reflections settle. In our final section, we shall turn from history to practice, exploring how the Socratic method might be applied in our own lives, and why the art of questioning remains relevant in the world we inhabit today. But there is no rush. The questions await us, patient and enduring, ready whenever we are ready to take them up again. The journey continues at its own gentle pace. We connect far together now, through the ancient streets of Athens and across the centuries of philosophical inheritance. We have met Socrates, understood his method, explored the philosophy that animated his questioning, and traced the long arc of his influence through history. Now, as our journey draws toward its close, let us turn to something more intimate and personal. How might the Socratic method be practiced in our own lives? What can the art of questioning offer us, here and now, in the midst of our daily concerns? The Socratic method, as we have seen, is not merely a technique for professional philosophers or law professors. At its heart, it is a way of engaging with ideas, with other people, and with ourselves. A disposition of curious humility, of patient inquiry, of genuine openness to the possibility that what we think we know might be incomplete or mistaken. Let us begin with conversation. Most of us spend a significant portion of our lives talking with other people, friends, family members, colleagues, acquaintances. These conversations can range from the trivial to the profound, from small talk about the weather to heartfelt discussions about meaning, purpose, and value. In all of these exchanges, there are opportunities to practice the art of questioning. What does this look like in practice? It begins with listening, truly listening to what the other person is saying. Not waiting for our turn to speak, not formulating our response while they are still talking, but genuinely attending to their words, their meanings, their underlying concerns. Socrates was, by all accounts, a remarkable listener. He paid close attention to his interlocutors, noticed the assumptions embedded in their statements, caught the tensions between one claim and another. When we listen this way, questions arise naturally. Not challenging questions designed to prove the other person wrong, but curious questions that seek to understand more deeply. What do you mean by that? Can you give me an example? How does that fit with what you said earlier? What led you to that conclusion? These are simple questions, but they can open up a conversation in remarkable ways. They invite the other person to reflect, to clarify, to go deeper into their own thinking. There is a spirit of generosity in this kind of questioning. We are not trying to win a debate or expose the other person's ignorance. We are trying to understand, genuinely, sincerely, with respect for the other person's perspective, even when we disagree. This is what philosophers sometimes call the principle of charity, the practice of interpreting others' statements in the most reasonable way possible, giving them the benefit of the doubt, assuming that there is something worth understanding, even in views we find initially implausible. Of course, not every conversation is the right occasion for deep philosophical inquiry. Sometimes we just want to chat, to connect, to enjoy another person's company without probing the foundations of their beliefs. The art of questioning includes knowing when to question and when to simply be present. Socrates himself was known for his sociability, his enjoyment of good company, his willingness to participate in the ordinary pleasures of Athenian life. Philosophy was not, for him, a withdrawal from human connection, but a deepening of it. When we do engage in more substantive conversations about politics, ethics, religion, or the meaning of life, the Socratic approach offers a valuable alternative to the patterns of argument that often dominate our public discourse. Instead of asserting our views and defending them against all comers, we can ask questions that help both parties think more carefully. Instead of trying to score points or win the argument, we can seek shared understanding. This does not mean we should never express our own views or never defend positions we believe to be correct. Socrates had views, strong views, about virtue, knowledge, and the good life. He was not merely a neutral facilitator of other people's thinking, but he also recognized that the most effective way to change someone's mind is often not to argue with them directly, but to ask questions that lead them to discover problems with their current beliefs for themselves. People resist being told they are wrong. They are more open to insights they feel they have reached on their own. There is also the question of how we ask. The tone of our questions matters enormously. A question asked with genuine curiosity feels very different from a question asked with sarcasm or condescension. A question that invites reflection feels different from a question designed to trap or embarrass. The Socratic Method, properly practiced, creates a space of psychological safety where both participants feel free to think aloud, to consider possibilities, to change their minds without losing face. This brings us to an important ethical dimension of the art of questioning. With great power comes great responsibility, as the saying goes, and questioning is indeed a kind of power. Used well, it can liberate, freeing people from unexamined assumptions and opening new possibilities for thought and action. Used poorly, it can manipulate, confuse, or wound. We have all encountered people who ask questions not to understand, but to dominate, who use interrogation as a form of aggression. True Socratic questioning requires humility. It requires acknowledging that we too might be wrong, that our own beliefs might harbor contradictions and confusions we have not yet noticed. When we question others, we should be willing to turn those same questions on ourselves. What do I mean by justice? What is my evidence for this belief? How would I respond if someone challenged this assumption? The examined life that Socrates praised is not one in which we examine only others while leaving ourselves unquestioned. And this leads us to perhaps the most important application of the Socratic Method, the inner dialogue, the practice of questioning ourselves. Socrates spoke of a daimonion, a kind of inner voice or divine sign that would sometimes warn him when he was about to make a mistake. Whether we understand this as a supernatural phenomenon, a highly developed moral intuition, or simply the voice of conscience, the idea of an inner interlocutor who holds us accountable to our own best understanding is deeply Socratic. We can cultivate this inner dialogue through deliberate practice. When we find ourselves holding a strong opinion, we can pause and ask, why do I believe this? What is my evidence? Are there alternative views I have not considered? Am I being influenced by bias, self-interest, or tribal loyalty? What would someone who disagreed say, and how would I respond? This kind of self-examination is not comfortable. It is much easier to hold our beliefs unreflectively, to assume we are right and those who disagree are foolish or malicious. The examined life is demanding. It requires intellectual honesty and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. But Socrates believed, and many who have followed his example would agree, that this discomfort is the price of genuine understanding, and that the rewards of self-knowledge are worth the effort. There are also practical benefits to this habit of self-questioning. When we examine our beliefs carefully, we are less likely to be blindsided by objections we had not anticipated. When we understand the weaknesses as well as the strengths of our position, we can argue for it more effectively. When we have genuinely considered alternative views, we are better equipped to find common ground with those who hold them. Self-questioning makes us more intellectually robust, more epistemically resilient, better prepared to navigate a complex and uncertain world. Of course, there are pitfalls to avoid. Endless self-questioning can become a form of paralysis, an inability to ever commit to any belief or course of action. Some people use questioning as a way to avoid responsibility, endlessly deferring judgment rather than making the hard choices that life requires. This is not what Socrates modeled. Despite his profession of ignorance, Socrates acted decisively when action was required. He served as a soldier, participated in political life when called upon, ultimately chose death rather than compromise his principles. The examined life is not a life of perpetual hesitation, but a life of thoughtful engagement. Another pitfall is the temptation to use questioning as a way to avoid genuine inquiry. We can ask questions rhetorically, not because we want to learn, but because we want to appear thoughtful, while actually maintaining our existing views unchanged. We can go through the motions of self-examination without ever really opening ourselves to the possibility of being wrong. True Socratic questioning requires intellectual courage, the willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions we did not expect or do not welcome. Let us consider some specific types of questions that might be useful in our daily practice. First, there are clarifying questions, questions that help us understand what someone means. When you say justice, what exactly do you have in mind? Can you give me a concrete example of what you are describing? How would you distinguish this from that related concept? These questions are simple but powerful, cutting through vagueness and forcing both parties to be more precise. Then there are probing questions, questions that dig deeper into the foundations of a belief. Why do you think that is true? What evidence supports this view? What would have to be the case for this not to be true? These questions encourage us to examine the grounds of our beliefs, to distinguish between well-supported conclusions and assumptions we have never really investigated. There are also questions about implications, questions that explore the consequences of holding a particular view. If this is true, what follows? How would this principle apply in a different case? Are there any implications of this view that seem problematic? These questions help us see whether our beliefs form a coherent whole, or whether they contain tensions and contradictions we had not noticed. Finally, there are perspective-taking questions, questions that invite us to consider alternative viewpoints. What would someone who disagrees say? How might this look from a different cultural or historical perspective? Am I missing something that others might see? These questions guard against the natural human tendency toward confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and accept information that confirms what we already believe, while ignoring or dismissing information that challenges it. None of these questions are complicated or difficult to ask. What makes them powerful is the spirit in which they are asked, a spirit of genuine curiosity, of openness to surprise, of willingness to revise our views in light of what we learn. This spirit is the heart of the Socratic Method, and it is something we can cultivate through practice. There is one more dimension of Socratic questioning we should consider before we conclude: its relevance to the challenges of our contemporary world. We live in an age of information abundance, where more content is available to us than any previous generation could have imagined. We are bombarded with claims, arguments, images and stories, many of them designed to capture our attention and influence our beliefs. In this environment, the ability to question, to sort the true from the false, the well-founded from the specious, the meaningful from the trivial, is not a luxury but a necessity. The Socratic Method offers a form of intellectual self-defense. When we encounter a claim that seems too good to be true, or too perfectly aligned with what we want to believe, we can ask, what is the evidence? Who is making this claim, and what might be their motivations? Are there alternative explanations or interpretations? Have I sought out perspectives that challenge this view? These questions will not tell us with certainty what is true, but they can help us navigate the information landscape more wisely. At the same time, Socratic questioning can help us engage more constructively with those who see the world differently than we do. Our political and social discourse is often characterized by mutual incomprehension, by the assumption that those who disagree with us are either ignorant or evil. The Socratic approach invites us to set aside these assumptions, at least temporarily, and to ask genuine questions about the views of others. What experiences have led them to their beliefs? What values are they trying to protect? What might they see that we are missing? This does not mean we should abandon our own convictions or pretend that all views are equally valid. Some beliefs are better supported by evidence than others. Some values are more conducive to human flourishing. But even as we maintain our commitments, we can engage with others in a spirit of respectful inquiry, seeking to understand before we judge. This is not a recipe for consensus. Genuine disagreements may persist, but it is a path toward more productive conversation and perhaps toward the discovery of common ground we did not know existed. As we draw toward the close of our exploration, let us return one last time to the figure of Socrates himself. He lived in turbulent times, times of war, political upheaval, and rapid social change. He witnessed the rise and fall of Athenian power, the corruption of democratic institutions, the confusion of traditional values. In the midst of this turmoil, he devoted himself to the pursuit of wisdom, to the care of the soul, to the practice of philosophical inquiry. Socrates did not claim to have the answers. He did not establish a doctrine or found a religion. What he offered was a method, a way of engaging with the deepest questions of human existence that remains as relevant today as it was in the agora of ancient Athens. That method begins with a simple, humble admission: I do not know. And it continues with a question asked in genuine curiosity: what do you think? With a soft, contemplative tone. In the end, the Socratic method is an invitation. It invites us to examine our beliefs, to question our assumptions, to engage with others in dialogue, and to pursue understanding with patience and humility. It does not promise certainty or easy answers. It does not guarantee that we will arrive at the truth, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, a way of living with questions, a practice of inquiry that enriches our lives and deepens our understanding, a path toward the examined life that Socrates believed was alone worth living. And so, as our journey together comes to its gentle close, perhaps you might carry with you not an answer, but a question. What do you truly know, and what do you merely believe? What assumptions have you never examined? What conversations might you have, with others or with yourself, that could open new possibilities for understanding? The questions are patient. They do not demand immediate answers. They wait for us, as they have waited for seekers across the centuries, ready to be taken up whenever we are ready to engage with them. The art of questioning is never fully mastered. It is a practice that deepens over a lifetime. But every genuine question is a step on the path. Every moment of curious inquiry, a small act of philosophical courage. Socrates believed that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of caring for the soul. In questioning, we tend to the deepest part of ourselves, the part that seeks truth, that yearns for understanding, that refuses to rest content with comfortable illusions. This care is gentle, patient work, the work of a lifetime, never complete, but always worthwhile. Rest now, if you wish. Let the ideas settle like leaves drifting down through still autumn air. The conversation continues whenever you are ready to return to it. For now, know that you have been a companion on this journey through the streets of ancient Athens, through the centuries of philosophical inheritance, and into the quiet depths of your own wondering mind. The questions remain, soft and enduring, a quiet invitation to reflection. And perhaps, in some future moment of stillness, you will find yourself asking one of them, genuinely, curiously, with the humble recognition that you do not yet know the answer. In that moment, you will be practicing the ancient art that Socrates taught, the art of questioning that is the beginning of wisdom. For now, it is time to rest. The examined life awaits you, patient and unhurried, ready whenever you choose to take up its gentle demands. Until then, may your sleep be peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet light of understanding, dawning slowly, like the first soft glow of morning over the hills of ancient Greece. Rest well. The questions will be here when you wake. And in that waking, perhaps you will find that the world looks just slightly different, more open to inquiry, more rich with possibility, more deserving of the careful, loving attention that genuine questioning brings.